You're listening to the Rethreading Madness podcast, which airs live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We are recorded and produced on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to our show.
I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright.
I'm Bernadine Fox. Here on Rethreading Madness, we talk about all manner of things that impact on our mental health. Today, we're going to talk with Ninu Kang, Executive Director of Ending Violence Against Women, also known as EVA. It is a follow-up show to the one that we did at the onset of COVID, looking at commonly known variants that increase the amount and intensity of violence against women. In this program, we look back with Ninu to find out if COVID did indeed increase the numbers and intensity of violence against intimate partners. Please know that while we do not go into the details of violence against women, this program may be triggering to some folks. Please do what you need to take care of yourself in this hour. At the end of the program, we will provide some information on where you can get assistance if these stories are resonating with you. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ninu Kang, who is the Executive Director of Ending Violence Association in BC here. And it's a kind of a follow-up to our show that we did when COVID first hit about how organizations such as EVA were concerned that this pandemic may in fact impact on domestic violence survivors. So welcome, Ninu, to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Bernadine.
So one of the things that when I had spoken with Tracy Porteous, who was the previous executive director to EVA, was that there was a concern based on historical facts that COVID would in fact impact on people who were experiencing domestic violence in some kind of severe ways. And I was hoping that in following up, you could tell us what you guys found did happen. Were the predictions true? Did they come about as we were worried about, and or what did happen?
Right. So when you did the show with Tracy Porteous, who was the executive director here prior to me, we were in the middle of really trying to adapt our services, not only in BC, but across Canada, in relation to supporting survivors of gender-based violence. And, in the early days of COVID, it became really clear for our sector that our services were very much in the community one-on-one. We supported survivors. They would come into the office and, sometimes we'd support them over the phone. But a lot of it was that there was this relationship and supports that was built for survivors. So all of a sudden, when things shut down and people were isolated in their home, of course, we knew one is that the dynamics of gender-based violence is that it's about these types of crimes. We sometimes talk about it as power-based crimes, and that they're often crimes that, they're in intimate partner relationship or whether they're sexual assault. They're based on one person having more power and positionality in that relationship over another. And often, they're gender-based. So we knew that women and more vulnerable populations would end up being in homes with their abusers. And so we, of course, predicted that isolation that was created, more control over who the victim is speaking to, who the potential person that was controlled, and not being able to access friends, people at their workplace, their own family and community resources. We knew that perhaps we predicted that would become so hard for them. The other dynamic, Bernadine, that happened is that this work in our society, which is supporting survivors of gender-based violence, was really not talked about a lot. There was a lot of focus on first responders. So there was a lot of gratitude and recognition of the work in the hospitals, nurses, doctors, emergency front responders, and so on. And while the workers that were supporting survivors of gender-based violence in their communities, that work was so important, but it was almost invisible in the public discourse. And so while our services were trying to quickly figure out how to go online and provide the services with limited technology and all of those things, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on our frontline workers to actually feel good about their work, knowing that the violence was high, but they were having less ability to support survivors.
So what kind of technology did you guys have to put in place to now deal with how the impact was, how the pandemic was impacting on your ability to provide services?
So we have, if you look at the new funded sexually assault services, we have nearly 300 frontline community-based programs across our province in BC. And so we at the Ending Violence Association of BC, with some amazing corporate partners and funding partners, we were able to provide technological support to our programs. And so really what people needed to do was to be able to go on Zoom and provide those services. So workers who couldn't come into the office needed to have laptops that they were able to take home.
Right.
We had to quickly adjust to helping our workers figure out how they were going to have a safe place inside their own homes to be able to continue to do this very confidential and highly, work that requires high level of confidentiality and integrity. And so there were so many of these conversations that services across our province were quickly trying to adapt the services. We were able to provide some support through our association, the Ending Violence Association of BC. And I also know that there were some local communities across our province where those programs exist. They were also able to tap into fundraising efforts and so on and so forth to help them adapt. There were resources that did come in from the federal government into our sector to try to help increase that technological infrastructure. So, some things were put in place, but it was quite challenging to pivot, to be honest.
Well, I would imagine too that the other side of that coin is not only did the frontline workers need new technology and ways of overcoming the obstacle the pandemic was putting in our way to offer services, but also I'm wondering what happened to people who were in their homes, who were trapped with their abusers, who also needed to adapt on their end to be able to access services. Did you find that impacted on your ability to provide services, that people didn't have access to Zoom or didn't understand Zoom? Or I know here on the radio station, we, of course, our station closed down. We're in the heart of the downtown east side. We shared a lobby with a clinic. So we just felt immediately that to provide some safety for the downtown east side, it was better that, all 75 of us programmers weren't zooming into the downtown east side and bringing our guests and everything. So we just literally closed the station down and we all took our programs home. And there was a quick sort of scrambling, much like you described, of trying to figure out, how do we record in our homes? How do we upload from our homes? And one of the things that I discovered is that a lot of the population that I'm working with as a radio host and interviewing, a lot of the folks didn't know Zoom. They didn't have a microphone. They didn't even understand some of them didn't understand how to use their phones to do an interview over the phone with Zoom. So it became very complicated and it took time. So did you find that was true for people who were trapped in their homes with their abusers, trying to access services, probably without letting their abuser know that they were?
Yes. We did hear that from our members, because it's our members who are actually serving on the front lines. So we did find that in addition to people not having technology. I know nowadays most people have the phone, but if you think about the most vulnerable populations in our society, where they're low income, there might be language barriers, or there may be indigenous communities that are in rural communities where internet may not even be that great. And so definitely the technological assets that people needed, survivors needed to even connect to a local service through the technology, that was missing for them as well. So again, we worked with some telecommunication companies to try to get phones out to our frontline programs so that they could make those phones available to survivors.
Right.
And so that was an initiative that I think was in recognition that people, maybe not on Zoom, but they want to be able to have access through a phone and to be able to access resources. And so it's while our services were trying to adapt, survivors and victims out there were trying to figure out how to access our services. The other thing that happened is services in the community generally became inaccessible. When you think about health services, or you think about even, our general social services, social assistance, all the justice, courts, for example, shut down or went, they were coming into the community less often, or they went online and so on. So that was another barrier, because our services is one of many things survivors need in order to sort of reach safety. And so when not only were our services becoming more of a barrier for people to access, but it was like we didn't know where to refer some of the individuals, because we knew that traditionally services we offer to them are now also shutting down, or we don't know the status of their service delivery.
So if we could just go back just a tad, did the violence towards people who are battered, or it's not quite what I want to say, let me re-say that. If we look back, do we have any stats on whether the violence increased on people who were suddenly, trapped in their homes with their abuser and didn't have access and were more isolated? How did that impact?
Well, in October 19, 2022, Statistics Canada released a report. And this was about victims of police-reported family and intimate partner violence in Canada in 2021. So this was a statistics over the year of 2021, but the report was released in 2022. And Bernadette, what this data told us, which is really interesting, because this was also the time where there was lots of questions about the justice system after, the Me Too movement, and just sort of mistrust in the police system after Floyd's death. But interestingly enough, rates of police reported sexual assault and intimate partner increased. So, there's various levels of assault. So level 1 sexual assault, which is defined as sexual assault violating the sexual integrity of the victim. Amongst that group, from 2020 to 2021, it increased by 22%.
Oh my.
And then if you look at sort of this, again, in the category of police-based crimes, crimes that were what we would say with a weapon or causing bodily harm, which is a fairly severe form of assault, that increased by 6% as compared to 2020. So which is interesting, because this was the time when society was questioning whether the police was the right place to get support for these types of crimes. And it's also noteworthy that even prior to this, it's important for us to know that the severity of this issue is much greater than what police data tells us. So, because, for example, we know from lots of research that only 5% of survivors of sexual violence actually use the police and report to the police as a way of getting some justice.
Mm-hmm.
So think about that. 95% of sexual violence, sexual assaults that happen out there never come in front of the police.
Right.
And so within that, we are seeing an increase. And in comparison, about 19% of survivors of spousal violence, so intimate partner violence, will report to the police. So there we see a little bit of a higher percent trusting the police will do something. Like almost 20% of people who experience intimate partner violence will choose to use the police, but only 5% of sexual assault survivors.
Right. So, and you said that spousal violence went up during that time as well?
So they don't delineate the data in this particular report, but when we know, for example, that very low reporting happens in sexual violence. And so the reports that come to the police, we know majority of them are domestic, intimate partner violence.
Right.
So yes, when you look at increases of 22%
Yes.
in, just comparison, that we're talking about individuals stuck in their home with an abusive partner who is controlling many, many aspects of their life. And the resources for them to be able to reach out and get help are less and less limited.
Oh yeah, they were so isolated. I mean, I look back at that time and, I wasn't even able to see my grandkids, never mind being in an abusive situation where you need to access family or friends for support. It must have been terrible. What about death? Did the homicide rate go up for women during that time?
So we're also seeing general increase in homicide rates. And so again, we've used statistics like one woman every 6 days in Canada on average. One woman every 6 days in Canada on average is killed by her intimate partner.
Oh my God.
That's a staggering.
So shocking. And it's not like I haven't heard it before, but every time I hear it, it's like I get shocked again.
And I was speaking to a colleague of mine when I was using this statistic and sharing it out in our trainings. And she also shared with me that there's new data coming out on homicide. And that is we're starting to see women being killed, not necessarily only in intimate partner violence, but on average every 2.5 days in Canada. So you're starting to see this, starting depending on how you look at data. I mean, data, you always need to sort of make sure that you're presenting it in the right way.
Yeah.
But what's staggering to me is whether we're looking at every 2.5 days or 6 days that a woman is killed. I think what's staggering for me is that this is in the lands we live in, the country we call Canada, because sometimes this particular issue is sort of seen as a issue of immigrants or in other countries, or sometimes when people refer to third world or developed countries, that somehow, in other parts of the world, men are terrible and women are being victimized. And so when immigrants come to these countries, that somehow, they bring that culture here. But in fact, I think what's important for all of us to own and acknowledge is that when we look at these types of crimes, they're pretty much cross all cultures that choose to live in these lands. And we also know that sexual violence, domestic violence, communal violence, and that experience is at proportionately higher rates for Indigenous women and men. And that's based on, and that sort of intersects with the racism that they also experience as Indigenous racism. So that issue is much more complex. But what's important to note is that there isn't any one community that we have seen from research that is showing that they're more violent than other communities. It's a Canadian issue. It's an issue of our lands.
Yes. Yeah. And it says volumes that even if somebody's coming here and committing that violence, that it says volumes about our community, that that in terms of Canada, that this is what is acceptable in Canada, period. I mean, that's period, right? Whether you're, regardless of what race you are. I'm Bernadine Fox. I'm speaking with Nino Kang, who's the executive director at EVA, which is the Ending Violence Association of BC. And we've been chatting about how domestic violence was impacted by the pandemic. Or actually, I should say how the pandemic influenced and impacted on people who were dealing with domestic violence in their own lives. One of the things that I wanted to do, just for our audience, is to have the term gender-based violence defined, because not everybody understands. I understand, you understand, but not everybody does understand what that means.
Mm-hmm. So, gender-based violence is certainly the term that we're using now. There's a national gender-based violence action plan. We're looking at a provincial gender-based violence action plan, and it does need to be defined what that is. Just to kind of give a little bit more context, for many, many years, I've been at this work for over 30 years, Bernadine, and we used to talk about violence against women. And, this work and this advocacy really came out of the women's movement, recognizing that women disproportionately experience many forms of violence based on kind of, us living in male dominant societies. Our systems and structures were built on male history and male centeredness. Now, what we're also seeing as we're starting to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and looking at and truth and reconciliation and missing and murdered women's, a report on girls, women and girls, like there's so many things that we're starting to look at in our society, is that we're saying that, look, this issue isn't so binary. It's not about women or men. It's about, and of course, many individuals don't identify with either woman or man, and that the even gender identity is more fluid, and also recognizing that there's certain individuals in our society that sort of are pushed out into the margins based on their positionality, like based on who they are, how they identify. Do they identify as a woman, non-binary person, immigrant, indigenous, living in poverty, with challenged ability, with living in a rural community. So there's a number of things that an individual's positionality, where they live and how they are, that puts them at a higher risk of experiencing certain forms of violence. And so therefore gender-based violence really kind of opened that, it forced us to have that deep conversation. So more specifically now, when we start to talk about how gender-based violence is played out. So I just described to you, the definition, like who fits into gender-based violence. Right. But when we start to look at what is it, what are we talking about? We're talking about sexualized violence. We're talking about intimate partner violence, where you're in an intimate relationship and there are dynamics, very specific dynamics within that relationship that causes violence. We're talking about bullying, harassment. We're talking about perhaps even opening the conversation into workplace bullying and harassment. And now, more recently, Bernadine, as the Office of the Human Rights is starting to look at the different groups that are positioned on experiencing violence based on hate. We're also starting to have a conversation that is gender violence. Is that a form of hate? So we're really starting to open this conversation about gender-based violence, and also starting to look at the intersection of violence that's created by hate. And so, I'm kind of giving you a very kind of early discussion on this, and I'm not sure if your listener, your other speakers have spoken about this, but I think we're going to hear more about the different forms of violence, and perhaps looking at violence that is caused towards a group based on hate.
Right. That is very That's a great explanation. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. I just want to go back as well to the idea of what happened because of the pandemic. So would you say that in terms of the long-term impact on domestic violence, did the abuse that they suffered during the pandemic, did it intensify? Has it continued to be intensified now at this point? Did this isolation that people went through, did it continue on? Is the dynamics different now for frontline workers in terms of getting assistance to people? And did the homicide rate go up for folks?
So, let's look at intimate partner violence for a minute, because a lot of our cases that come through to our frontline workers are where individuals are in relationship, and predominantly women, and they're experiencing violence in that intimate relationship. So, we talked a lot about the isolation and the control and coercive control that the abuser was able to have on their victim. But one of the things that we also saw, and that's what our frontline workers who are seeing these people come through their service say, is that the severity of violence increased. So, if it was something that survivors said that, I'd get pushed around, or if he was upset, he would push and shove. So we saw more severe forms of violence reported by frontlines, where there's more bodily harm caused and things like that. So we know that went up. And the other thing is kind of the magnitude of the violence went up as well. And that's another thing that when our frontline workers were talking to the people that access their services, they said it's happening more often. When I was isolated, we would have more arguments and more fights, and it would just happen more often. So again, that's a very pandemic related issue, which is that one thing, and again, it's consistent with what we've known about those individuals that use violence based on power crimes, where they're in a powerful relationship, that often it's about control, power over, coercive control. And whenever there's a feeling that control is being taken away, or when the person is the person that's experiencing violence is kind of, resisting, or I don't want to use the word pushing back, that has a physical analogy, but more or less who is like saying no, like no more. We also know that becomes a high risk factor for victims. That if somebody decides to leave a relationship, we know that that's when those victims are at the highest risk of violence, including homicide, including possibly being killed. So we know that threats of violence, the actual violence, has gone up, because when victims or survivors have tried to leave those relationships because it was just too hard. In terms of what the question about whether we've seen an increase in homicide number, that's what my colleague has shared with me. I'll need to do a little bit of a deeper dive in order for me to be able to give you sort of exactly how that's showing up in homicide research. I had a quick conversation with my colleague Kate, who works with us, and she did share with me that we used to use this word every 6 days a woman is killed. Now we're starting to look at some homicide data that is on average every 2.5 days.
Right, you had mentioned that, yes.
Yeah, but again, I want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting that, because some of the data that's coming through is about general, women being killed. So I want to sift through that, but again, that in itself is alarming as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
When we're seeing women killed on average every 2.5 days, and you listen to the radio, and we've seen recent murder. There was a woman killed in Surrey just less than a week ago, and we're we don't turn on the radio, more than a week when we're not hearing about a woman that was killed, or there was a, homicide and the person killed themselves as well. And it appears to be an intimate partner relationship, but, sometimes we can't really say that until it goes through the court system. And when that actually reveals itself. But often when we know that when it's a domestic situation, we can sort of make some assumptions early on. So it's a, it's a, I want to call it, what's the language I'm looking for here? I want to call it that it's an invisible crime still in our society. We hear about it, we hear it in the media. Sometimes, we hear it within our distance relations or within our community. But unfortunately, majority of us, and it's not because we're bad people, but majority of us sort of like get on with our life on our day to day, and it sort of like goes by the wayside, this issue around gender-based violence and how prevalent it is and how many individuals it impacts in our society. I would venture to say that when a woman is killed in a community, in an intimate partner relationship, I would say the whole community is impacted.
Yes.
And we're talking about her children, her own family, her extended family, and rippled into the whole community. And yet we are so complacent. Yet as communities, we're so complacent.
Do you want to venture a guess as to why we are complacent? I mean, it's not like we haven't been talking about domestic violence since, I don't know, early 80s, I think, at this point. So how did we end up here 40 some years later and still not be outraged at what is happening to women in our society?
Mm-hmm. Well, this probably would be a whole different segment, but I'll take a stab at some of my ideas. I'll take a stab at some of my ideas. Violence against women historically, and men sort of leading nations and leading worlds. I mean, that's the human experience. If you think about liberation of women and equality and equity for women, that is like just in the last less than 100 years, if you think about it. And if you look at evolution of humankind, that's a little like that's yesterday. We started talking about women and women's equality and equity. If you look at human evolution, right? And so if you look at it from that perspective, people, especially I would argue men in positions of power, have not bought into this idea that women need an equal space. So, we are wired, we're socialized still to be seeing men in positions of power. There was a report that just came out the other day about, 100 most highly paid individuals in Canada. Majority of them are men, and we're still seeing men in predominantly institutions in leadership roles, and salary of men being higher than women, even doing the same job. We're still looking at that kind of data, and so I feel like women being equal, that concept, that construct, and hence demanding equity. Is still deeply kind of troublesome for most of society, and I would argue even for women, because we're also wired to think that we are less and that we deserve less, and why are all the women making such a fuss? And so when our young women, our next generation, are demanding right over their body or wanting to be able to wear whatever they want without being victims of sexual predators, many men and women, because of our sort of wiring, will blame the person that has been violated.
Yes.
What was she wearing? Why did she do that? Why did she ask for it? Why was she alone with him? Why did she choose to go to the hotel room? And all of these kinds of things. And so, like I said, it could be a full show, Bernadine.
I know. I get it. I do want to point out that this idea of women not being equal, I believe, is a colonial perspective, and it's something that's been imposed on us. I believe, and I'm certainly not the expert on this, but my sense of First Nations culture is that very often women had the same kind of equal rights that men had, more predominantly than that is true here in our colonial world now.
Well, and that's certainly something, we have learned from our Indigenous, colleagues, our leaders, who have told us. And of course, probably both of you are bringing in kind of what we've been gifted, the knowledge we've been gifted by Indigenous people. And so, I'm sharing that here on the radio. But yeah, I mean, what we are told is that this was a matriarchal society. Women held families and communities together. Women were making decisions on behalf of their communities, and that when the colonizers came, they didn't even want to deal with the women here, Indigenous women. They were sort of like, why are you in the room? And so Indigenous leaders, women leaders, had to put forward their son-in-laws or their husbands or their brothers to go and negotiate with the colonizers, because they wouldn't even have the women in the same room to be able to talk about, whatever the conversations would have been between the colonizers and the Indigenous people here. So, so you can see, and of course, that's another full conversation, which is about, about colonization of these lands and what our responsibilities are as settlers and what happened to Indigenous communities. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. But we know that systematically, matriarchy within the Indigenous community was erased as a result of the patriarchy that was brought in to these lands, and hence patriarchy is flourishing all very well.
Absolutely. It definitely is doing that. And hopefully we're poking some holes into it. The other thing I want to talk about, I know it's really easy to go to the bruises and the murder of people and identify that as abuse. But I'm also wondering the impact of the pandemic, maybe for people who weren't experienced domestic violence beforehand and it intensified from there. Did people who hadn't been experiencing domestic violence, did it start during the pandemic? And did maybe emotional violence become more extreme as well? And were you guys seeing that in terms of your work during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. I don't have sort of feedback from our frontline workers on that, whether there was more first time, people reporting that this just happened to me as a result of pandemic. I don't have that sort of distinct information. However, one thing that there is a correlation, or if you want to call it a relationship, that individuals, when they're experiencing stress or when their own trauma is triggered, that a use of violence can increase. So it's not like it always will. It's not like if you're experiencing stress, you'll go and start beating up your wife or your spouse. It's not that direct correlation. But we do know that when somebody loses a job, for example, or when when there's more economic hardship, or there's been some natural disasters and so on, we know in general domestic violence goes up.
Right.
And so I think certainly that happened. I have no doubt that individuals who never sort of had that experience, all of a sudden they found themselves in an abusive relationship, and it's sort of, not knowing what to do. And perhaps even, there's many individuals who'll be like, one time is too much, and if somebody experiences it one time, they're considering ending the relationship. But the dynamics within intimate partner relationships in general, what we hear is that those who are survivors and victims of intimate partner violence, what they tell us is that they will try in so many different ways to salvage that relationship. And sometimes this perception comes out when we think of backlash, and they'll be like, oh, women are just using the police. They just call 911 and they're misusing this system. Of course, people have differences in their relationships. So why do women just, call 911? Well, I can tell you on the radio that no woman, no person chooses to call 911. Mm-mm. Nobody wants in their daily life, in their good way, to get the police involved. That is not something anyone wants to do. It takes a lot of thought, a lot of consideration, lots of other things in place where they try to make things better before people will actually, choose calling the police as a way of intervention. And so I think when you see people use the police or even access such services, I always think how hard it must have been for that person to say, tomorrow I'm not going to go to work. I'm going to see if I can go make an appointment because I'm experiencing this form of violence that I just cannot handle on my own. So just imagine the courage and the effort and the energy and thoughtfulness it must take for a person to come to our services,
Right.
or to pick up the phone and call the police. So I think that that's a really, I think it's important for all of us to contemplate on that, that it's not easy. There's lots of dynamics within an intimate partner relationship. This is the person we chose. We love this person. This is our person for life sometimes. That's how we imagined it.
Yeah, father of my children, mother of my children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Financially. And now I may have to create an intervention that's going to end all that. So it's a very challenging and difficult decision that survivors make, and I don't think we can take that lightly.
No. We need to just take a little break, Ninu, but if you have time, I'd like you to come back and I'd like to just chat with you a bit about the emotional fallout and places where domestic violence survivors are left once they do, while they're in the process of trying to cope with domestic violence, but once they leave. Do you have time for that?
Sure. We'll come back.
All right. Thank you. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm chatting with Ninu Kang, who is the Executive Director at Ending Violence Association of BC, otherwise known as EVA, or EVA, I'm not quite sure how you guys say it, about domestic violence and how it was impacted by the pandemic we've all come through and are in some ways still experiencing. Ninu, I wanted to chat with you about the impact on our mental health and our mental well-being when we are subjected to trauma, and in particular domestic violence. Can you address that a little bit for folks?
Yeah, and we go by EVA.
Thank you.
Bernadine. Yeah, Ending Violence Association of BC. EVA seems to be a very good acronym that we can use.
Absolutely, is perfect, quite frankly.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the issue of trauma, Bernadine. Like I said, I've been in this field for a very long time, and I remember in the early years, going back 30 plus years, we didn't really used to talk about trauma. For those who had experienced domestic violence or intimate partner violence, sexualized violence, we knew how women presented themselves when they would come in for support services, and that was they would perhaps be overly emotional. They would be crying or shaking and so on when they would come into our offices. And then we also would sometimes see women just being very, kind of controlled, and they would tell their story, and it was almost like maybe they were disengaged with what they were telling us. And so I remember myself as a counselor back in the days, and perhaps not even really knowing what was happening in the neurobiology of that person. We knew what was happening, and then our training was to listen attentively. It was to sort of, reframe what they were saying and ask them if we understood what they were saying. And in my training, I learned that it was about being present, and it was being compassionate, and it was being open, and listening, and that would be a form of support, because anyone that's experienced this type of violence, often they're shut down. People don't have enough time to listen to what they have to say. And so we understood the power of being somebody's witness. So that stuff we knew. But what we didn't know back in, or certainly I didn't know, I think back in those days, was that what was happening to these survivors in their body and in their brain. Now we know that these types of crime, individuals are experiencing trauma. And we know that when someone experiences trauma, their brain, the chemistry in the brain changes, and so we're flooded with hormones in the body, and the brain and the body is so smart, it'll shut down certain parts of the brain, and it'll activate the part of the brain that needs to protect itself, protect the body, and so it's either fight, flight, or freeze. And so again, back to kind of my early days, not surprising, there were women who were coming in here and, they were overly emotional. They were re-experiencing trauma when they were in the room with me, or they were shut down. They were in a freeze mode. So we were seeing trauma being reactivated even when they were telling their story. And so, when you talk about what is that in relation to mental health, well, individuals who are experiencing trauma, and perhaps over and over again, that experience of trauma means that if I'll just maybe play this out, but let's say that in the evening, there's been an experience of violence, whether it's emotional violence or sexual or physical violence or any form of violence within an intimate partner relationship. That person, okay, maybe was crying or maybe was shut down or what have you. Now they've gone to sleep and maybe they've slept off a little bit of that and their body has composed, but they get up in the morning, they're still with the same abusive partner. Then they're in inner body. Maybe they wake up in the morning and re-experience the trauma, and now they're coming to work, right? And when they come to work, their performance is going to be impacted because their brain, the shift in the brain with regards to feeling not safe and feeling that not only lack of safety, but that emotional distress. So what's happening is if this is happening to you over and over again, that's leading you to all kinds of physical, mental impacts on your body. And again, I think, I'm not a physician. And I know there's many other individuals who know a lot more about mental health issues than I do. But speaking from working with individuals who've experienced domestic violence, you can see it in their faces. You can see it their body experience when they're in the room with you, and they speak about this. They speak about forgetting things, not remembering things, or having panic attacks, or experiencing what sometimes survivors start to use the language if and when they feel comfortable, feeling depressed. Sometimes they start to use that language, and when you kind of open that up, you can see that if they were to go to a mental health professional that or a physician, that they would probably diagnose them as on the continuum of depression or anxiety and all of those. So that's how you see it manifest over into mental health, Bernadine.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. And we do know as well that trauma is at the basis of so many of the diagnoses in the DSM-5, that if we took out all the ones that were related to trauma, we would end up with a pamphlet. So trauma and mental health go hand in hand, and the impact of it. So if we look at just domestic violence survivors, what kinds of mental health issues are they dealing with while they're still trapped in a relationship and after they've left? Because it's not like they leave and everything is wonderful and they have all this insight. Often domestic violence survivors are leaving in a fog, knowing that they have to, or they're going to die, or they have to, or their kids are going to be hurt, but may not be completely resolved about all the issues that are impacting on their mental health.
Well, I want to make 2 points about this, Bernadine. One point I want to make is that survivors of domestic violence don't necessarily, there's not a direct correlation to that they will be experiencing mental health, issues. Okay. Now, I'll clarify that they'll experience trauma. But I also have had so much experience with survivors who are so resilient, who have coping mechanisms, and who have found ways to sort of find ways of surviving and living in that situation. So that's why my point one is I want to honor those individuals, because sometimes there's a stigma. Okay, if you've experienced violence and therefore you have mental health issues, there isn't that direct correlation, and nor do we want to make that direct correlation.
Absolutely not. No, thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. No worries. So I think that, that I think is a really, and same with addictions, right? Sometimes it's sort of like, okay, if you're a survivor or something, you're going to go and hit the bottle and you're going to have experience of addiction. We know, for example, the resiliency of Indigenous people, there isn't that direct correlation. You've got some, individuals who, despite colonial experiences, despite residential intergenerational, conflict, there's mobilizing within that community, and there's work that's being advanced in that community. So we know that there isn't that direct correlation, and that people are resilient. Okay, so the second point, so if we look at the other side of the coin to that, is absolutely trauma will lead to, sort of if trauma is not, addressed, it's not supported, a person doesn't have supports in place to be able to understand trauma and find ways to, build resiliency and kind of, find a safety within their life and have those people around them. If there isn't a good way to come out of that, then yes, things like anxiety show up, Renadine. I talked about depression, and also you'll see physical symptoms show up in people. So it'll be like headaches, backaches, arm, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it's hard to make that connection. Like, why is my shoulder being thrown out? Why is my lower back getting knotted up? What is that about? Because trauma lives in the body. Mm-hmm. So trauma, now we know from research that trauma not only lives in the body, it lives in our DNA. So we also know that it's intergenerational. And so again, the impact of ongoing domestic violence in our society, intimate partner violence, sexualized violence, all forms of gender-based violence, if not addressed, we are actually like moving our species into this constant, like we're building into our DNA to continue to experience trauma by these types of things. I just want to take this minute to share this one research piece that many years ago, and I'm sorry I'm not able to give credit because I heard it at a presentation. And this was somebody talking about an experience of sexual assault as a child. Mm-hmm. Childhood sexual abuse. And what they said is that an individual who experiences childhood sexual abuse, but it goes unrecognized and unsupported, the level of trauma that person will experience, that young child, and the impact it'll have on the trajectory of their life is worse than a child being born in a refugee camp with, war planes or rockets hitting there and that. The difference between those two individuals is that the child in the refugee camp is surrounded by people who love the child. Yeah. Might be mother, might be people at the camp, might be other folks that come together and hide under a bunker or whatever that is. So for that child, even though the circumstances are so much worse, that child will be more resilient, will have a higher level of success on their trajectory once they come out of it than a person that experiences early childhood sexual abuse and nobody is seeing it and nobody is supporting them. So from that, to me, what really shows is that if someone is experiencing this type of violence, if we can surround that person and provide as much support, whether it's from their family, whether it's from services like our frontline community-based anti-violence programs, whether it's that first contact with that first police officer, whether it's that Crown Counsel who speaks to you in a way that just warms your heart, or the social worker or the nurse, all those things matter. All those things matter in a way a person will overcome their trauma.
Yes, and I completely agree with that. It makes so much sense that it's not so much the violence one goes through; it is the aftermath of it that can make the difference. And we see this. One of the things I do is I volunteer to support men and women, who have experienced abuse by their therapist. And as much as we've been talking about this for 40 years, the level of support in the community for those people is so desperately not there that they come to us having spent years trying to find the resource, because it's so hard to even Google and find it. But once they get there, I mean, it's just being surrounded by people who support them and understand what they've gone through makes all the difference for them. And the trauma to them prior to that is so profound. It's such damaging, profoundly damaging trauma. So I can just use that as an example of the difference of somebody who's been sexually exploited in our community, and that's been accepted by our sexual assault centers, and they've been embraced and they've had some framework, as opposed to the person who's told, you just had an affair, get over it. Right? It's a very different thing. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you, Nina, for talking with us about this issue. It's so important, and I'm hoping that we have overcome the impact of the pandemic, and that ultimately it has given us some new and wonderful tools to help people be able to cope with what they're going through and get out and get to safety.
Thank you, Bernadine. And the sort of the final thing I will say to listeners is that if anyone is experiencing any of these types of crimes that we've spoken about, or any of the symptoms that are showing up in your body and so on, please know that there are supports in the community. And I always pitch BC 211, Bernadine, because it's a resource that anyone can call into, and it's sometimes not well known by people, that they can call and just chat to somebody on the other side and tell them their situation, and that person will direct them in many different ways. And there's lots of language support there. Different languages are spoken and supports provided through that. So I think that's just really important for our listeners to know, that if you're sitting with something, you're not alone. Please reach out, and if your circumstances get better and change, that's wonderful. And so thank you for your time, Bernadine. I really appreciate you giving me some space on air to talk about this very important issue.
No, thank you for spending the time with us and chatting about it. It is an important topic. We've been chatting with Ninu Kang from Ending Violence Against Women here in BC. We see that violence in intimate relationships increased dramatically during COVID. It seems domestic violence abusers are clearly predictable. Situations like COVID highlight that even more. If you're experiencing violence in an intimate partnership, you can reach out to 211 in BC, Canada. If you're listening to this program from another part of the world, find a women's organization in your community to help you connect with support. You can also email us here, and we will work our network to get you some help. My thanks goes out to Sherry Ulrich for the gift of her music, but most importantly, and as always, our thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. I'm Bernadine Fox, and you've just listened to Rethreading Madness, the podcast that dares to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.
I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright. It's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why don't magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say